everybody, welcome to another episode from the JC2 podcast series. As you can probably hear, we are still in a live location, aeroplanes flying overhead. Feels like we're in some sort of conflict-ridden country, in a war-torn situation. Chaos is everywhere. Well, it might be quite aligned to what we're going to talk about today in terms of our responses to the AFC. This is part 2 of the podcast series on the responses to the AFC. We are going to be throwing the spotlight on the IMF today and seeing what kind of approaches they implemented in the AFC as a means to kind of counter the effects of the crisis, to try to remedy the situation. We will be assessing how well they did what they set out to do, and therefore our overall assessments over here will go back to effectiveness as well. Keep in mind that the IMF is a non-state actor. In a sense, it is an international economic organization. I feel that it is the foremost international economic organization. There is a measure of credibility and gravity attached to the words and the sayings and the prescriptions from the IMF. So naturally, whatever they do for Southeast Asia, to Southeast Asia, we would probably have to assess them with great measure as well. There's a high level of significance that is attached to this economic organization. Election fever is at high. I hope that you guys have been keeping up with the politics and the developments that are going on. We see the power of social media last time round, where many things are brought to light and surfaced as a measure of a response to the introduction of candidates from a certain prestigious, credible political party. We are looking at very interesting elections this year, where it seems that the online sphere is going to be a battlefront, I suppose. It's going to be the front lines of politics this time round. So you guys are astute enough to understand how that world goes. So I encourage you to do check out all the things. With the Ivan Lim case, it seems that with whatever you do in the past, it might come back in some way. So next time any of you are running for politics, I'll be like, no, this one cannot. Zheng last time you talked too much in class. Cannot. Like, who else? Ming Kang, cannot. Sleep in class, cannot. Just joking, or not. We'll see how it goes. Now, for today, going back to our topic, I just want to assure you guys that even though I have my own personal views to this entire situation with the IMF and the AFC, I will attempt to present it as balanced as I can, and to give you that freedom of assessment and not pigeonhole you into any particular view. Although I think that it is pretty hard to do so, especially for the immediate responses of the IMF, not to see it as more detrimental than it is constructive. So we'll take a look at that. I'll try to present it as balanced as possible to give you the context and the rationale as to why they are doing certain things that they're doing. But keep in mind that this is just looking at the initial responses of the IMF, and later on we will be looking at later responses from both state actors as well as non-state actors. So do keep that in mind, but for today we are going to be focusing on the immediate responses and the assessment of the IMF. Aptly titled, this one is called Fire in the Theatre. It's from one of the quotes later on you'll see. But what a emotional and what a drama mama way to term this topic, to term this study. Feels like some indie band that no one has heard of, and they just released a single called The IMF's Initial Response. Wow, how cool a song that would be. A choir people, come on, let's compose a melody for this. Going into the syllabus document itself, we can see that it's still the same stuff. We are looking at the responses. We are looking at the responses from state and non-state actors. So today in particular, we'll be looking at the non-state actor over here, in particular quite a significant one. Last time round we looked at the state actors primarily, but now we're looking at the non-state ones. So in most responses essays, you will be required to assess and identify their respective roles and responsibilities, as well as evaluate their relative importance or their relative effectiveness against one another. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind, and this will be our focus for today. Let's start out with an amazing quote. Let's start out with a quote over here. We say, sorry, a bit distracted. A lot of people judging me as they walk by. All these juniors, lower sec kids saying, "Oh my God, this guy's strange, talking to himself." I'm like, man, I'm not strange. Great. Instead, the IMF arrived in Thailand in July 97, filled with ostentatious declarations that all was wrong and that fundamental and immediate surgery was needed. Now, the context here is that, remember, in the past, we looked at how the IMF gave a clean bill of health, gave good reports on the Southeast Asian economy, saying that everything was going well and so on and so. But now there's almost 360 reverse. No, 180. Oh, can't do math. 180 reversal of their policies, and right now they are going into crisis mode, and they're saying that there's a lot of structural decay, there's a lot of structural problems, and so on and so forth. A complete reversal of what it was like in the mid 1990s, and when they gave the. So there's a lot of issues with the diagnosis of the IMF. Looking into the situation in Southeast Asia, you can see that the economy, as I said, is a really scary thing. And even for an international organization that is credible in itself and that has a strong reputation, do get things wrong. I can't emphasize this enough, right, guys, that no matter how credible you think an institution is, no matter how credible you think a government is, no matter how credible you think a policy is, like, they are vulnerable, they can be prone to mistakes, and the mistakes can really cost dearly. So in this case, we are looking at the IMF, and I just want you to keep that idea in mind, that the IMF, for all you think that it is, it can also create problems, and it can also misdiagnose or just misidentify certain core issues within the economy. The IMF deepened the sense of panic, not only because of its dire public pronouncements, and public is a public institution, its words has gravity and a weight to them, but also because its proposed medicine, this is really like a disease, man. It's like COVID, right? We're looking at a remedy measure over here. Its proposed medicine, high interest rates, budget cuts, immediate bank closures, convinced the markets that Asia was indeed about to enter a severe contraction. Remember how I told you guys that sometimes investors, invariably as they make their moves, as they do their stuff, right, invariably they might actually worsen the crisis. In themselves, they are the primary actors that are driving the crisis. So that is possible, right? That is possible. In this case over here, it seems as though that IMF also falls into that kind of developmental mode where you can sense that the Southeast Asian economies, one by one, they're getting into trouble. And the IMF comes out and make all these public statements, and they deliver all these prescriptions and all that. And it's very alarmist because it's very severe. The magnitude is pretty high, and the changes that they propose are really drastic and this kind of stuff. So it does send a signal that these economies are really in danger, and that continues to fuel the speculation, that continues to build up that sense of expectancy that Southeast Asian markets are going to fall, they are going to collapse. So this is one of those cases, right? It's a chicken and egg kind of thing, but more so that, it's a chicken and an egg. Okay, forget the analogy. I don't really know how I'm going to use it. But yeah, basically the idea here is that, speculators or investors, as well as the IMF, in trying to conduct their own activities, might invariably also worsen the situation. So in themselves, they also can be actors that fuel and contributed to the worsening of the crisis. As it happened earlier in the South American countries and Eastern European countries over there, instead of dousing the fire, the IMF in effect screamed fire in the theater. So it's like they're saying, oh shit, guys, there's some shit going on here. We need to save the situation. Let's do some, big stuff, and let's. So basically, it's like, what will you do, right? If someone screamed fire in the theater, right? Of course, you are going to be running to the exits. Guys, do you remember what a theater is like, by the way? I know we haven't been there for long, so it's one of those like rooms where you sit and you watch a movie, like together. There are many seats, and there's this big screen like in front of you and stuff like that. I don't know if you really remember, but yeah. So someone screams fire in that, then you just be running out. And that's exactly a great analogy for the Asian financial crisis, right? Because here you have an international organization screaming that this is a crisis. So obviously investors looking into the situation, this is the best or the prime indicator that holy crap, this is all going downhill. So that's the kind of effect that IMF could have and did have in this situation. The scene was repeated in Indonesia in November, so following up from Thailand, and Korea in December. As I said, it's not just a Southeast Asian thing, it spread to East Asia as well. So this kind of gives you an initial sense of the, number one, the importance and the weight of the IMF, but secondly, it gives you a sense also about how the IMF, even though it had good intentions, even though there was an intended constructive mentality over here, it can invariably lead to problems as well. So, as I promised you guys, like, let me try and give a balanced, understanding of the IMF. Remember that the IMF is a credible economic organization. It is an institution that is a force of stability, right, in the global economy. I'm pretty sure you might have dealt with this in some manner in IH, but it is one of those key institutions in the global economy, and it is a source of support and financial assistance to many countries in the developing world, and also for countries that run into trouble. The kind of, IMF, F is fund, right? The kind of money and the kind of capital that you have over there is very crucial to the development of nations and to the stability, the economic stability of nations. So that is the context behind its role and what it's set out to do. But over here in the Asian financial crisis, what we want to see, or what I propose for you guys to see, is that the IMF has failed on two counts. Number one, it has failed to forecast the Asian crisis because it was looking at the wrong indicators and it was giving very misleading reports. Maybe not intentionally, but whatever it is, they did it, and it created a false impression of Southeast Asian economies leading to the crisis. Even when the crisis broke out itself after July 97, the IMF continued to downplay the severity of the issue. Again, I don't know whether this is intentional or this is just simply a miscalculation, but whatever it is, they did it, and it kind of added fuel to the fire as well. Second one, inappropriate and ineffective strategies and therapies or remedies prescribed to national governments in an attempt to remedy the effects of the crisis. So once again, the action outcome framework comes in here, where you look at certain actions that are being done by national governments, or in this case, the IMF, but then you question the quality of the actions and you ask yourself, judging it, is it effective? Did it really align to the core issues? Was it a correct diagnosis of the issues in the first place? And what were the outcomes that arose from whatever IMF was calling for? Just to give you an idea of how, again, scary the economy is and how this crisis in itself was really a shock to many. Even the IMF themselves didn't anticipate, that this would happen, and certainly they didn't anticipate that this would escalate to such a scale and such an extensive magnitude in terms of economic damage to, what is basically the entire region. So they were surprised by the events of the AFC. They misjudged the gravity of the situation in the initial stage and the extent that it would become. So once again, sometimes it's like it's hard to predict economic trends, especially if there are extraordinary events that arise. It's quite difficult to predict these kind of things. But certainly when it does happen, when you want to diagnose the event and you want to find out the core issues and all that, by that point, as an international economic organization, you would expect them to have some measure of accuracy, some measure of astuteness and insight. But even then, I think there was really some issue with all that, and later on we'll take a look at it. IMF intent was to project milder crash estimates so as not to encourage panic-driven economies. So remember when I said that the IMF, right, they are very aware of the weight that they have, the kind of influence and the clout that they have within the global economy. So I think they were aware that they couldn't project too alarmist um, public statements and that kind of stuff. So they wanted to project milder crash estimates so as not to continue to fuel the capital flight and the bank runs and all that kind of stuff. You can see why they wanted to do this. It is to send public statements of assurance and confidence. But at the same time, while I can understand what they were doing, I think whether or not this was the best strategy, the best measure forward, this is hugely in question now, because all these kind of stuff actually did continue to, and Mr. Chia is here trying to distract me with his packet of chicken rice or something. Yeah. Yeah. So again, whether or not this had a good effect is something that you should question, and you can consider it as part of the unsound kind of strategies that the IMF had, especially at the initial part of responding to the crisis. Additionally, the IMF, right, had another oversight, and this was a bit of a it's a bit of a tunnel vision. It's a bit of a narrow-minded focus. But at the same time, you can also understand why IMF chose to fixate themselves in this way. The point here is about how the IMF was looking at economic situations, or the economic structures and the pillars of all the countries. But I think what they failed to take into account, and what is, as I mentioned before, very distinctive about the AFC, is the political social situation as well, that really formed a lot of the foundations of the economy and a lot of foundations of the bad practices in the economy, actually. So you see, when you diagnose something like this, where a lot of the decay comes from places not only just from the economic sphere, but going into politics as well, a lot of the remedy measures needs to be targeted against that, because that's the core of the problem. That's the fundamental. But over here, it was a diagnosis. This is an economic situation. Let's propose economic strategies, which might help, but might not fully deal with the core of the issue. And so that was another problem that they had as well. I love all the IMF photos that I found this time. On a new set of slides, the previous batches didn't get all these things. And I love the photos because you can kind of tell the kind of the grimness of the situation, and how it was not just an economic spiral, but I think it was an emotional spiral as well. The other thing about the IMF over here, the huge cost of IMF maxi packages and the accusation of massive waste of taxpayers' money. So basically, when IMF had their policy recommendations, a lot of them required the governments to splash out cash, and a lot of this cash was taxpayers' money, and they needed the taxpayers' money to kind of save the economy or a particular sector or something like that. 20J14. 20J14 is saying hello to this podcast. You want to say hello to your? You say hello to your seniors. Say hello to your seniors.
Hi, seniors.
Yeah, hello. Okay. Thank you.
Why are you so homeless?
Why am I so homeless? Chloe. That was Chloe from 20J14. Okay, coming back here. Look, a lot of the policy recommendations from the IMF, they needed the taxpayers' money to governments to splash the cash and that kind of stuff. And in a crisis situation, you have this kind of policy recommendations where you need more money coming from the people or from the government. While it may, I'm no big economist. While this may be a sound, or while this may be a necessary strategy, it doesn't look very good, politically speaking, right? In a crisis, you institute policies that says, I need more money from you, or I need more money from the people. I mean, that's political suicide to me. So I think the IMF was, one of the big problems with the IMF's response was that they were very, very harsh, if you want to call it that, on their conditions. And a lot of their conditions were very strict. And so that caused a lot of political consequences as well. So you take a look over here, Thailand 4 billion, Indonesia 11.2 billion, and this is all in USD, guys. So you can, it's massive amounts of money that is required from the state itself, and so this is a further drain on resources, number one. But I think the political consequences here are much wider. A lot of the protests that you will see later on in Indonesia, in Thailand, and actually other parts of Asia, especially in Korea as well. Actually, they were anti-government, but they were also anti-IMF protests. So that just gives you an idea of how unpopular all these kind of policies were. Another thing, there's another criticism of one of the IMF's key policy recommendations. So criticisms against the deflationist approach of the IMF. Again, you don't have to go too much into explaining what deflation is, but if you need the explanation is towards the side over here. And going down the line over here, the standard practice for IMF, which is to try to save economies in crisis, is that they will institute like all these four things, or there may be more lah, but primarily there will be these four things over here: strong restrictive monetary policy, financial sector regulation, bank restructuring, tight fiscal policies. Now, guys, a lot of these things you can understand why they instituted it, and in fact, some of these things over here you see does align to the core issues that the national economies were facing, especially in the finance sector. So on that note, I think this might be theoretically sound. But I think the issue is that, again, while this is sound, a lot of these kind of policies, right, required a lot of effort on the part of the government and on the people as well. And at that point in time in a crisis situation, it's very complicated by emotion and survival politics. So while all these kind of things are sound, that it will face a lot of resistance because of the context of the situation. That's number one. Number two is that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these things you can see are economic policies, and okay lah, there's regulation involved as well, but it doesn't address the core issue of things like the patronage networks or the crony capitalism that is going on, and self-interest and so on and so forth. So that is another, I wouldn't say it's a misalignment, but definitely that it is an inadequacy in that it doesn't really address the core issues at that point in time. So I want to introduce this term to you that you see over here. You might be thinking, like, what is it about? And the term here is austerity. So austerity, I think you might have heard this term like many times. Even now, many governments, when they seek help, they have to go into austerity measures. Austerity measures basically just means that you want to be more controlling, you want to be more reserved in your spending, especially government spending, right? This means to say that it doesn't, right? The IMF wants the governments to save lah, basically to save more, that kind of stuff, to cut spending. But I think the problem here, the last point you see, is this is a misalignment, because the problem here in Southeast Asia, right, it's not a problem of over-consumption. Even by government standards, it's not a problem of over-government spending or over-consumer spending. Like, that wasn't the problem. But the IMF diagnosed the problem as such. And why did the IMF diagnose the problem as such? Is because it had dealt with similar situations in the past, in the recent past actually. Sometime in the 1990s, South America was facing such issues as well. So over there, this might have been a problem. The IMF extrapolated what they learned over there and applied it to Southeast Asia and this Asian financial crisis, where in fact the fundamentals and the foundations and the sources of the crisis was all was vastly different. So I think when you as an international organization, right, when you apply these kind of transferability policies that you think can be applied to different contexts, without really diagnosing the depth of the problem, right, then it's going to lead to like a lot of issues lah. So here the IMF prescribed for austerity measures at a time where the economies needed to be spending in order to get out of the recession. So you heard this old like very old saying, say you got to spend your way out of a crisis. Like you need to consume, because you need to get the businesses back. You need to get the money flow and the money cycles going and all that. It's just like in Singapore right now, with the with the circuit breaker period, and now we're in phase 2. Kind of like the idea is to consume, so that our businesses. Oh, it's a loud play. So that our businesses and our hawkers and so on and so forth, it can all get back into the swing of things. There's a good money supply flow and so on and so forth. But the misdiagnosis here is that the IMF is saying, hey guys, basically stop spending, like save up more, that kind of stuff. So that's a big problem over there. A lot of these problems, as I said in the previous podcast, right? The AFC is such a huge economic crisis that it has political and social consequences as well. This gives you an idea of how large the magnitude of the crisis is at this point in time. So with the IMF and them stepping in, number one, it really looks bad on the international level because number one, this is a public kind of move in that sense, and when IMF is needed to step in, or when you request for IMF assistance, your country is in trouble, like it's in the shits basically. So kind of like it sends a lot of political signals. That's number one. So it's kind of a ill feeling situation to be in. That's number one. Number two, right? The IMF is a Western institution, and many Southeast Asian policies, right? Many Southeast Asian countries have a very antagonistic, or at least a very unstable relationship with Western intervention. I'm not saying with Western countries, but with Western intervention. And that is a problem over here because when the IMF intervenes, especially in Indonesia, there is this sense that the Western power or the white man, is coming back to dictate policy and to impose upon harsh control and so on and so forth. So there's this element of sovereignty or this element of independence that is taken away. It harks back hashtag throwback, like throwback to colonial times, right? Where it was a similar situation, where Indonesia, fresh out of a colonial past, has all these kind of residual feelings and so on and so forth. So it kind of like throws back to the colonial legacy and things like that, and it really spills out into the social dimension. So as if the people weren't incensed enough already by whatever the situation they were in, plus whatever the Suharto government was doing, and whatever was being reviewed about the Suharto government. Right now they have to deal with this compounding factor of the IMF as well. Chloe, Yingshen also, and Rain as well. These three girls keep walking by. So layers upon layers of this kind of animosity and ill feeling and so on and so forth, it builds up and it translates into a social crisis. So there are a lot of bread and butter issues, but there are a lot of these kind of political issues that surface as well. A lot of the animosity against the Suharto government were anti-IMF protests, and when the protests were being when it was spilling over into the streets, right? A lot of the posters that they were holding was anti-Suharto posters. So it gives you an idea that the crisis has reached such a level that now it is anti-government and it is spilling over into the streets, literally right at the doorstep of the house of the president. There are other things that the IMF does. In this case, try to induce a small depreciation and this kind of stuff. But I just want you to see again that there are certain actions being done, but then with regards to the outcomes, it is not forthcoming at this point in time. So there is a question over the effectiveness and the alignment of IMF policies at this point in time. You see this inducing of a small depreciation thing, but then you see the consequence, the Thai baht continued to fall 50% in value, Indonesian rupiah fell by 75% in value, that kind of stuff. So again, there's when you judge intent, right? The IMF coming in, but then when you judge the kind of outcomes that are arising from their intervention, you can see there's a huge misalignment, or at least there's a huge disparity in whatever they are trying to achieve over there. So that's something for you guys to assess. But always keep in mind that this is something that is in the immediate phase of responding to the crisis. Just like last podcast, I did talk about national governments, but it's mostly contextualized to the immediate phase. And here we have the most iconic photo, I feel, of the Asian financial crisis. Because over here, remember just now what I talked about, all that kind of residual feeling towards Western powers and the white man and that kind of stuff. And you know, sometimes photos, right, they're just oh man, they're just like timed wrongly, or it's just something that is unintentional. But you look at a photo like this, and when this photo gets splashed across like the entire world, and you see like Suharto, he's bending down and he's signing a document, and the white man, this is the boss of IMF, the white man, he's just like folding his arms and looking over it. What kind of nonsense like message is this, man? I mean, if I give you this as an SBQ source, definitely I think you'll be able to come up with these kind of like messages that are coming out of this photo. And so too the people of Indonesia, as you see this kind of things happening, a lot of ill feeling towards the IMF and a lot of perception. Well, I can't emphasize this enough. A lot of perception that whatever the IMF was doing was in the interest of Suharto and was still hurting the national economy and was still hurting the ordinary folk and the people. So it's the kind of how should I put it, disparity. It's the kind of gap and disparity between what is actually happening versus what is perceived to be happening. And perception often dictates policies and often dictates the development of things, because when people perceive certain things, they see it as truth. Doesn't matter whether or not it's false. They're not going to go like, oh, I'm going to, according to my CR and bringing in my CK, provenance checking after, you know, it won't even come to that, right? Whatever they perceive in the emotional state of mind at that point in time is going to be perceived as truth. And so I think this photo, you know, kind of like when it was splashed out, it kind of signaled the death knell for Suharto in power, because it sent a lot of signals to the Indonesian population that Suharto was I mean, to put it harshly, was not fit to be the president anymore. And so very, very, very unfortunately, in my opinion, but I mean, that's how history went. So one of the big problems, as you see over here, why people have such ill feelings towards the IMF and, you know, to images like this, is because the IMF will give you the funding you need, and they are called disbursements. So IMF will give disbursements in the millions, right? They'll give you the funding that you need to save your economy. But this funding will always come with conditions. And the problem with IMF conditions is, it's not that they're bad or they're not sound. They usually are. But again, in that context, at that point in time, right, a lot of these conditions, they are perceived as being too harsh, and they are not doing it in the interest of the people. So politics, you know, it gets caught up in all these kind of like other things. Economics, it gets caught up with all these kind of other things about politics. So I just want you to understand that dynamic relationship over there. So there's a conflict between measures that deal with long-term policies aimed at preventing another crisis versus measures that are for this particular one that they are feeling right now. So I think the thing about IMF's prescriptions or their conditions and all that kind of stuff, right, a lot of it is very structural, right? And we've discussed what structural means. And with those kind of associations, right, it's going to be a long-term project. But the problem, right, is that at that point in time, they want immediate results, they want immediate remedy measures, and so on and so forth. So there's going to be like a gap in expectations from the people, and that's why, you know, it translates into all this kind of stuff. The last thing I have here is to show you a chart of exchange rates. Of course, there are many other indicators, but I want you to see that, taking a look at the indicators here from Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, right? You can see that, okay, there's the initial fall in 97, but, you know, going into 98, it isn't exactly on the steep rise, and in fact, in some cases, it is still falling. And taking the last podcast and this podcast together, it does really show you that the national governments and IMF and, you know, other actors, right, they are really facing an uphill task. Just gives you the size and the intensity of this crisis that is very, very difficult to solve. Even if there are sound measures, it takes time. And usually there are a lot of unsound measures and self-interest that are still permeating the solutions package that governments and international organizations are mounting up. So yeah, that kind of like ties in together the last podcast and this podcast. So yeah, the next podcast we will go into more measures in a slightly more longer term period, and also the consequences of the AFC, and that really will be the last of the fresh content lectures. And then after that, you guys are ready to hit it for the A levels. Am I right? Okay, let's do a cheer. Give me a H, give me an I, give me an S, give me a T, give me an O, give me an R, give me a Y. What's that? History. What's that? History. One more time. History. DJ Anesh out.